Welcome to another Composing for Public Audiences MOOC office hours. I'm Paula Miller, and Kay Halasek is here with me, and this week we're going to be talking about revising rhetorically.
Good. Hi, everyone. Yeah, Paul and I are really anxious to talk with you about this particular unit. I think for me it's one of my favorites because it's really informed by a lot of really intriguing scholarship and pedagogies and teaching for in advanced writing classes in particular. And so we're going to talk about some of the reasons that we selected, some of the materials that we selected for this unit, and also talk through some of the details of what Joe Harris in particular is outlining in his book Rewriting, from which you read a selection. And then Paula and I are also going to be talking a little bit about our own revising practices and how those practices might change over different kinds of publishing or producing texts that we do on a regular basis. We're also happy to take any questions that you might have, so if you're in the chat and would like to contribute some questions, we'll be watching for those. And we look forward to engaging you in that fashion. And if you're viewing later, welcome. We hope that you have an opportunity to look over what we've been talking about today and using it as you revise either your public service announcement or your research-based project for what we're calling Module 5. So this is a revision module. You're not producing a brand new text. You're really working from what you've already produced and working to refine it and improve it.
So, you know, we could jump in and start talking a little bit about what you read in the Harris piece. Now, in the Harris piece, there's some questions that you can kind of use as a starting point for thinking about revision. For in particular, what's your project, what's working, what works, what else might be said, and what's next. So I'm going to just take a minute to talk to you about thinking about what your project actually is. When you step back and say, okay, I'm going to look at the big picture, I'm going to think like globally, what is it that I really want to accomplish here? And taking that step back allows you to think, okay, so I've taken one route to accomplishing this goal in this draft, but there are so many other roads that you can take with different scenery, you know, like there are different approaches. So stepping back and saying, okay, what is my goal? What do I want to accomplish here? Can be a really great way to think of new avenues for accomplishing that goal.
Mm-hmm. And I think that ties really nicely, Paula, into the notion of sort of revisiting the purpose. So as you reflect on what you've already composed, you can ask yourself, as Paula said, well, why did I choose this route? What does it accomplish? And is it accomplishing what I now recognize as what I want this piece to do? This is something I recognize as a writer, is that often I'll compose something, but as I reflect on it and ask myself this question about what really is my project, what's my purpose, and who is my audience, I find that those questions really stimulate for me new ways of thinking about how I might approach or compose, revise the project. The other part of that is actually encapsulated in Harris's second question, which is what works? And so we ask ourselves as writers, what can I build on? What are the strengths of my draft? Now, as often, and I'm guilty of this as a writer, when I go back to revise, I typically focus on what isn't working. And while we do want to attend to the weaknesses or our perceived weaknesses in a piece, it's really, really valuable to give ourselves the opportunity to reflect on what is working. Because if we find that sort of point or those points that really are strengths of our piece, those may be a kind of nexus of what we want to build on. So it might be a really helpful point of departure to focus on those strengths. It also is just very encouraging to spend some time asking ourselves and reflecting on what works.
And I love this idea of thinking about what's working well, kind of seeing the really good stuff that you've done and acknowledging that. And you can also think about, you know, through your journey, creating this research-based argument, you've seen a lot of different conversations, peripheral conversations about whatever it is you're arguing, different perspectives that people have. So thinking about what else might be said, how you can acknowledge other people's views and how you can do that in a way that faithfully represents and respects what they offer, while at the same time attempts to like persuasively engage those. That could be really useful to think about, thinking about everything that you have learned over the course of composing through the process, and then thinking about how you can loop back and weave that through your revision.
I think that's true of the PSA, the public service announcement, as well. Even though that's a much more sort of typically a more abbreviated piece, it still probably has it does have an informational or persuasive goal. So you might step back in and ask yourself that same question about what might be said, what else might be said. Is there something that, especially as you got feedback, because for those of you who did complete and post the PSA, you did get feedback from the instructional team. So were there any suggestions among the comments that you got that might lead you to think about what else might be said? So you can always also look back at the comments that you get from your readers to see whether they provide any sort of hint as to what they suggest might also be said. And then the final of Harris's 4 questions is, what's next? What are the implications of what you have to say? And other writing instructors and textbook writers, in particular Gerald Graff and Kathy Birkenstein, in their text, They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing, ask this question by saying, so what? And they don't mean it in that kind of offhand way that we sometimes use that colloquial phrase in U.S. English, like, well, so what? It's the so what? And so we ask that question and say, well, what are the implications of what I'm having to say? And if we take a moment in our own writing to step back and ask ourselves that question, first of all, we may find that we haven't yet gotten to the point where we're really able to articulate what the implications of our argument or our informational piece might be, of our researched piece. And so sometimes that has to do with not yet really sort of identifying what our project is, that first of Harris's questions, or it might be that we just haven't quite taken the research piece to the point that we might, so that our audiences clearly understand the implications of what we're arguing. So that's that 4th step for Harris. So you have, what's your project? That's what do you want to accomplish? What works? What else might you say? And then what's next? What are the implications? And for me, that sort of constellation of questions that Harris gives us provides me as a writer a very productive way of extending my understanding and my practice of revising. Harris also does, I think, a very fine job of distinguishing revising from editing. At one point in this chapter, he writes that the aim of revising is to rethink the ideas and examples that drive your thinking in an essay. The aim, on the other hand, of editing is to improve the flow and the design of the document. Both forms of work are important, but simply editing a text that needs to be rethought and revised, I love this metaphor, is like waxing a car that needs repairs to its engine. So we don't want to just wax the car. We want to make sure, if we need to repair or make more maybe efficient the engine of the car. And that's what revising is about. And that's where we want to pay first, and I would say most attention, as we move from, or as you move as writers, either from your PSA or your research-based assignment into a revision of those assignments.
So I love your metaphor, Kay. The car metaphor is so great. I was thinking about our own revision practices. I was thinking about the approaches that I take to revision. And because I come from a Writing Center's background, when I think, it's often very conversational. It's immensely productive for me to have conversations. And that's in part why we've set up these discussion forums for the students in the course, so they can talk to one another, and why we jump in and have conversations about their work. But I was thinking about how revision, if you break down the word, you've got re and division, like trying to see your piece again or see it in a different way or reimagine it. there are so many times, and in fact, this just happened yesterday when I was talking with a colleague about something I'm working on, where you have a really simple conversation with someone and they think, I don't know if what I just said was helpful. And you're sitting there and you're like, yes, that actually just blew things wide apart for me. That was fabulous. Thank you so much. This 5-minute conversation has given me like hours of material to work with to kind of like rework the project I'm working on. So I think for me, what's incredibly useful is to continue to go back to like other minds, people who might sort of mimic who my audience might be. I don't, Kay, what's sort of your go-to when you're working on revising a piece? What strategies have been useful for you?
In some ways, it depends on the kind of piece that I'm writing, but let's use something like a piece of academic writing, which is the bulk of what I do write. Like you, Paula, I engage in conversations. Sometimes those are email conversations with co-authors or with individuals that I just seek out because I know they might be productive readers of my text. And so the conversation is absolutely part of that process for me. You know, when I think about, well, how do I decide what to revise? Again, I'm gonna turn back to I revisit and I do really what Harris suggests. I say, you know, what do I want to accomplish? Because oftentimes in the course of writing a first draft of a piece, I'll sort of I'll develop an idea that I am very committed to or that I find very interesting. But then when I go back to look at what I've written, I realize, oh, I really love that passage or I really love that section, but it's not doing what I need it to do in this piece right now. So sometimes the revision is being very honest with myself about whether what I feel invested in is actually doing the work that it needs to do. And for me, that's actually the hard part about revision 2 is parting with something that I really appreciated writing and that I thought really worked at the time, but I now recognize might not help me accomplish what my goal is. So making that decision to revise for me is driven by purpose and audience and that question from Harris about what do I want to accomplish. So it takes a different form often. But I do ask that, I mean, depending on what kind of piece I'm writing, but as I think about it and say this, I'm reminded of the work of Maxine Hairston, who is a composition scholar. Years ago, probably in the 1980s, wrote a piece that it was titled, a scholarly article that it was titled Different Processes. And that was sort of the first time that anyone in our field articulated this idea that there is no one writing process, and what I want to do is piggyback on Hairston's observations and say there is no one revision process. We may employ some of the same strategies, but for me those strategies are unique to the piece of writing, the purpose, and the audience that I am sort of imagining for the piece.
Mm-hmm. You know, that made me think of a little quote that I've heard creative writers, I think it's a Stephen King quote, this idea that when you're writing, you should be willing to kill your darlings, which
that
sounds...
probably is Stephen King.
yeah, it sounds macabre, but in writing, when you're willing to kill your darlings, there are aspects of your work that you might feel really fond of and really attached to, but when you step back and sort of use Harris's framework and say, okay, so what is my goal here? And you realize that an aspect of your piece, you love it, but it's really not serving your purpose anymore the way it maybe did at the beginning of the project. Being willing to let that go. You can save it for later, maybe use it for another project, but I think that willingness to hit the delete key and let things go, sometimes it's really difficult for me. I know that can be the hardest part of revising, is letting the stuff that's good but not working go, so that you can make room for other stuff that will be more effective and suit your purposes more.
Right. And so when I think about that too, in terms of what you're saying, Paula, well, first of all, Stephen King's book, I think it's called On Writing. That, Paula, do you know, is that correct?
I think that's William Zinsser.
Oh, no, that is Williams.
Yeah.
William
Zinsser. King has a book on writing too. I don't remember. On Writing,
which is spectacular. We'll see if we can find the title of that. It's a spectacular book on his writing process, but on writing generally. And I think that's where that quotation comes from, Paula, that you mentioned. So when I think about revising researched pieces, one of the things, not only do I want to let go of or kill those darlings that I have, the other thing I really think about is spending time sort of making space for letting the research that I've done also direct my revision. So let me give you an example. So let's say I spent a lot of time researching a project on therapy dogs, and maybe making a case for my local university to make therapy dogs available. So I've done a bunch of research. Well, what I may want to do is return to that research to see whether, as you said it so well earlier, Paula, whether I faithfully represented what different sort of perspectives offer, and to have that conversation and extend that notion of conversation back into the research that I've done, because that may also, this process of revision may mean that I actually have to go back and do more research. I may find that the direction I was headed maybe isn't as successful as it could be if I go back. So part of the revision process for me for research is determining whether I need to go back and find more material. And this is going to sound contradictory, but sometimes the other part of that process is deciding when to stop doing the research, and in the process of revision, determining whether further research is going to be at all helpful. Because oftentimes I think writers who are working on research-based projects will spend so much time reading and developing and sort of marshaling their evidence that they don't let off with the research before they then move on to the revision, or even the writing or the drafting to begin with. And so for research, I mean, it's really focusing, again, as you said earlier, Paul, on that conversation. Mm-hmm. Do you, Paula, I know you do a lot of work with multimodal genres, do you find that when you work on and revise multimodal pieces that the process of revision is different for you? And if so, how?
I mean, I think the process of revision is a little bit different for every project because it depends on the needs of the project. But I think whether I'm composing in traditional print text or whether I'm composing multimodally, what I find really helpful for stepping back and rethinking my purpose and how well it's working is crossing modal boundaries. So what that means is your modes are your different avenues of composing. You've got your text-based mode, the audio, the visual, you know, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So when I'm composing a text-based piece and I'm revising, there are times when I will use color, or maybe I'll print it out so that I can handle it tactily, to maybe break the sections into physical pieces, like cut the sections up, move them around, depending on how large the project is. And the same sort of thing can be really useful for multimodal projects as well. If I'm working on a video and I have all these sort of chunks of footage and I'm saying, okay, so what is it I want to accomplish? Sitting down with a piece of paper and like drawing out alternate storyboards for the video, you know, mm-hmm. sketching out mm-hmm. different ideas, writing my way through it maybe with text. I mean, I think one of the affordances of composing often in a lot of different modes is that you take what you learn about what works when you're composing one mode and you can bring it to another mode to kind of like make what you're writing a little bit different and a little bit weird so that you can see it in a new way through that new mode. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I'm wondering, so, what I appreciate about how you described what you do in terms of this multimodal revision is two things. One, you identified a number of technologies, not all of which were digital technologies, right? You talked about the physical act of printing out a piece of paper and using the paper as a technology and then cutting it apart. So using scissors as a kind of technology, a way of, again, I want to go back to that notion that you use of revisioning, right? That physically laying out or creating a new storyboard, right? So using, there it might be a pencil and paper or something. as a way of re-seeing or revisioning a piece is extremely valuable. And I think it's interesting that even as we're in a kind of digital age and we compose, I do too, a lot on the computer, I find myself at the point of revision often printing something out, because there's something about the kinetic engagement with text and pencil or text and pen that somehow engages me differently with revision. I'm sure there's some sort of cognitive reason that that's really helpful for us, but it does make sense. And then, so the other thing that I think your comments suggest to me is that, so with a multimodal piece, where say we have, let's just say it's a visual piece. So we have something like a PSA that might be incorporate a lot of visual elements. What I also what I infer from what you said is you also really attend to the relationship between the visual and the alphabetic. And so those design elements aren't simply elements that you attend to when you edit, but you actually attend to them when you're revising, because the relationship between the visual and the alphabetic
her. So,
oh no, I didn't lose Paula. There's okay.
Good. So I think I missed the tail end of that. But to respond to what you were saying, yes, I absolutely think about all of the elements of the composition and how they're all working together. And what can be really useful too is very deliberately breaking your multimodal composition down into its elements, into its pieces and parts, and think about, okay, what's the relationship between this title, maybe this block of text, this image, the choice of this color scheme, and why did I put them where they are, and how else could I arrange them, and how would that affect what the viewer sees first? And because, you know, the order in which the viewer kind of scans your image is going to influence the ways they read subsequent images. So, you know, if they're reading, like a Western audience might read left to right, they're going to read your image left to right. So what you put on the left is going to influence how they read what's on the right. Mm-hmm. So when you flip those around, it can change the ways that people interpret your audience. It's subtle, but it makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. And that's true then too. And I can see how you can take that advice and that practice and apply it to alphabetic text. What comes first in the text, right? How we introduce something, what the introductory paragraph does is going to influence absolutely what follows and how the audience engages that. So there is a kind of, there's a similarity then in like the effect of the decisions that we make, even though they might be visual design elements as opposed to the order of sentences and paragraphs in a piece that's largely alphabetic.
You know, yeah, I was actually thinking a few minutes ago, okay, if our students have taken a look at the hashtag for the course, they'll see that some of the first tweets were images of our course design. Do you remember what you did the first day we sat down and said, okay, let's revise this course, right? Like I walked into Kay's office and she had giant sticky notes all around the wall with each module. And then she had the little colored sticky notes. And we spent time moving the sticky notes around and engaging tactily and like with color and with physical writing in revising the course. So I think these principles of revision, I mean, no matter whether you're revising a course or a text or what have you, yeah, they can all be useful and inform one another.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that reminds me, now that you were mentioning like color, I thought, well, and when I revise writing too, I mean, the other thing to think about to pull in information from Module 4 into Module 5 is the other thing you can really attend to, especially in research-based writing, is how you're using B, E, A, and M. And so I could imagine if I were really like struggling, or if I wanted to kind of repurpose something, or if I didn't feel like I was really achieving what I wanted to accomplish, I might actually go back and say, well, how am I using my sources? Do I need to revise whether I'm using or how I'm using background sources? And for me, because I'm visually oriented as a learner, I might, like you said, Paula, either take a highlighter on a piece of paper if I had printed this out, or put sticky notes where I'm using sources in different ways to see visually whether something seems unbalanced, too much of something, not enough of something else. But you wouldn't even just have to do that with Beam. You could do it with other elements of, say, the points that you're making. So if you have 4 or 5 major critical points that you want to make in a piece, where do they appear? What precedes what? Paula's advice a little bit ago about recognizing that what we say first and second is going to influence how readers engage points 3 and 4 is really, I find that a very insightful kind of way of just thinking about how to move through design and how to move through organizational principles in revising. I think I was just going to turn back, maybe as we have the time to do this, to one more point, or a set of points, there are actually 3 of them, that Harris makes about revision. And because each of you has received feedback from the instructional team on your public service announcement, if you turned it in, and you will be receiving feedback by tomorrow, Thursday, or by Friday morning, from the team on your research-based assignment. What you're going to have to do as part of your revision process is think about the comments that you get from your readers. What did you find most useful in rethinking your essay? So this is, again, a conversation, as Paula mentioned earlier. So as you revise, you'll be engaged in having a conversation, at least virtually or asynchronously, with the people the instructional members of the instructional team who responded to your piece. How do you rethink your essay based on the feedback that you've gotten? If you do plan to add to what you've written so far, this is a second point that Harris makes, what will you say and where will it go? So if you ask that question about, is there something else that I can add? That question, what else might be said? If you determine that there is something more to be said, where are you going to put it? Where is it going to go? Think about Paula's observation about what comes first influences what comes second, and so forth. So if you have new material, where does it go and why? And then finally, once you have a revision plan in place, then don't feel like you have to be sort of slavishly attached to it. Let the process of revision actually be generative, right? The end point isn't just a perfect piece of writing, because we'll never get there, but how does the process of revision itself help you re-see?
I love that idea of letting the revision process be generative, like allowing yourself to be open to the research and the revision, taking your project in a little different direction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes, and Paula, you and I we're sort of, we have to deal with this too, is we often, as writers in academia, whether we're students or graduates, undergraduate, graduate students, or faculty, is that we work under deadlines. And so often, because we have a deadline where something has to be submitted, turned in for a grade, and so forth, oftentimes revision isn't generative. It falls back toward, more toward editing and just trying to clean up what's there, rather than give us the opportunity to think more broadly, as Harris really encourages us to do, toward possibility, toward what else might happen. And we know you're working on a deadline here in the Composing for Public Audiences as well, but it's the piece that you produce for us as part of Module 5 doesn't end in Module 5. We really want to encourage you to take that piece and put it out in the public sphere. Really get it in the hands of the audience that you're imagining for it, and see what happens there. And even at that point, it can still be revised. It doesn't have to be static or only appear once or in one publication. It's something that you can continue to kind of curate and revise.
Well, I think that's a really lovely note to end on, Kay. So I think this has been a really productive office hours, and I am really looking forward to seeing what the students submit for their revision, taking a look at what they're turning in.
I am as well, always. I love looking at the revisions of students' work because it helps us see kind of how they've progressed in their thinking as they've moved from early to later draft. And sometimes those pieces look so different. It's really kind of an energizing process. This is our last office hours for the Composing for Public Audiences MOOC, but know that you can always contact us through the email function in Canvas. And you can drop questions there, and always as well, we have the discussion forums where you can converse with one another about your projects. We'll be checking those this week as well, and through the first part of next week. I think the revisions, Paula, am I correct, are due on Monday of next week?
I think that's right, but definitely refer to the module just to be certain.
Information sounds good. And so revise and resubmit, and we'll see your work in the Canvas MOOC. Thank you. Bye, Paula. Bye, everybody.